Seafarers we have ever been, and no wonder. As for me, the city of my birth is no more my home than any pleasant port between there and the London River. I know them all and they know me. Set me down on any of their quays or foreshores and I am home again. I suppose you go great voyages, said the Water Rat with growing interest. Months and months out of sight of land and provisions running short, and allowance as to water, and your mind communing with the mighty ocean and all that sort of thing. By no means, said the Sea Rat frankly. Such a life as you describe would not suit me at all. I'm in the coasting trade and rarely out of sight of land. It's the jolly times on shore that appeal to me as much as any seafaring. Oh, those southern seaports, the smell of them, the riding lights at night, the glamour. Well, perhaps you have chosen the better way, said the Water Rat, but rather doubtfully. Tell me something of your coasting, then, if you have a mind to, and what sort of harvest an animal of spirit might hope to bring home from it, to warm his latter days with gallant memories by the fireside. For my life, I confess to you, feels to me today somewhat narrow and circumscribed. My last voyage, began the Sea Rat, that landed me eventually in this country, bound with high hopes for my inland farm, will serve as good an example of any of them, and indeed as an epitome of my highly coloured life. Family troubles as usual began it. The domestic storm cone was hoisted, and I shipped myself on board a small trading vessel bound from Constantinople by classic seas whose every wave throbs with a deathless memory, to the Grecian islands and the Levant. Those were golden days and balmy nights, in and out of harbour all the time, old friends everywhere, sleeping in some cool temple or ruined cistern during the heat of the day, feasting and song after sundown under great stars set in a velvet sky. Thence we turned and coasted up the Adriatic, its shores swimming in an atmosphere of amber, rose and aquamarine. We lay in wide, landlocked harbours, we roamed through ancient and noble cities, until at last, one morning as the sun rose royally behind us, we rode into Venice down a path of gold. Oh, Venice is a fine city, wherein a rat can wander at his ease and take his pleasure, or, when weary of wandering, can sit at the edge of the Grand Canal at night, feasting with his friends, when the air is full of music and the sky full of stars, and the lights flash and shimmer on the polished steel prows of the swaying gondolas, packed so that you could walk across the canal on them from side to side. And then the food. Do you like shellfish? Well, we won't linger over that now. He was silent for a time, and the Water Rat silent too, and enthralled, floated on dream canals and heard a phantom song pealing high between vaporous grey-waved, lapped walls. Southwards we sailed again at last, continued the Sea Rat, coasting down the Italian shore till finally we made Palermo, and there I quitted for a long, happy spell on shore. I never stick too long to one ship. One gets narrow-minded and prejudiced. Besides, Sicily is one of my happy hunting grounds. I know everybody there, and their ways just suit me. I spent many jolly weeks in the islands, staying with friends up country. When I grew restless again, I took advantage of a ship that was trading to Sardinia and Corsica, and very glad I was to feel the fresh breeze and the sea spray in my face once more. But isn't it very hot and stuffy down in the hold, I think you call it? Asked the Water Rat. The seafarer looked at him with the suspicion of a wink. I'm an old hand, he remarked with much simplicity. The captain's cabin's good enough for me. It's a hard life by all accounts, murmured the Rat, sunk in deep thought. For the crew it is, replied the seafarer gravely, again in the ghost of a wink. From Corsica, he went on, I made use of a ship that was taking wine to the mainland. We made a lassio in the evening, lay to, hauled up our wine casks, and hove them overboard, tied one to the other by a long line. Then the crew took the boats and rowed shorewards, singing as they went, and drawing after them the long bobbing procession of casks, like a mile of porpoises. On the sands they had horses waiting, which dragged the casks up the steep street of the little town with a fine rush and clatter and scramble. When the last cask was in, we went and refreshed and rested and sat late into the night, drinking with our friends, and next morning I took to the great olive woods for a spell and a rest. For now I had done with islands for the time, and ports and shippings were plentiful, so I led a lazy life among the peasants, lying and watching them work, or stretched high on the hillside with the blue Mediterranean far below me. And so at length by easy stages, and partly on foot, partly by sea to Marseille, and the meeting of old shipmates, and the visiting of great ocean-bound vessels, and feasting once more. Talk of shellfish! Why, sometimes I dream of shellfish of Marseille, and wake up crying. "That reminds me," said the polite water rat, "you happened to mention that you were hungry, and I ought to have spoken earlier. Of course you will stop and take your midday meal with me. My hole is close by. It is some time past noon, and you are very welcome to whatever there is." "Now I call that kind and brotherly of you," said the sea rat. "I was indeed hungry when I sat down, and ever since I inadvertently happened to mention shellfish, my pangs have been extreme. But could you fetch it along out here? I am none too fond of going under hatches, unless I'm obliged to, and then, while we eat, I could tell you more concerning my voyages and the pleasant life I lead. At least, it is very pleasant to me, and by your attention I judge it commends itself to you, whereas if we go indoors, it's 100 to 1 that I shall presently fall asleep." "That is indeed an excellent suggestion," said the water rat, and hurried off home. There he got out the luncheon basket and packed a simple meal, in which, remembering the stranger's origins and preferences, took care to include a yard of long French bread, a sausage out of which the garlic sang, some cheese which lay down and cried, and a long-necked straw-covered flask wherein lay bottled sunshine shed and garnered on far southern slopes. Thus laden, he returned with all speed and blushed for pleasure at the old seaman's commendations of his taste and judgment, as together they unpacked the basket and laid out the contents on the grassy roadside. The sea rat, as soon as his hunger was somewhat assuaged, continued the history of his latest voyage, conducting his simple hearer from port to port of Spain, landing him at Lisbon, Oporto and Bordeaux, introducing him to the pleasant harbours of Cornwall and Devon, and so on up the channel to that final quayside, where, landing after winds long contrary, storm-driven and weather-beaten, he had caught the first magical hints and heraldings of another spring, and, fired by these, had sped on a long tramp inland, hungry for the experiment of life on some quiet farmstead, very far from the weary beating of any sea. Spellbound and quivering with excitement, the water rat followed the adventurer league by league, over stormy bays, through crowded roadsteads, across harbour bars on a racing tide, up winding rivers that hid their busy little towns round a stubborn turn, and left him with a regretful sigh, planted at his dull inland farm, about which he desired to hear nothing. By this time their meal was over, and the seafarer, refreshed and strengthened, his voice more vibrant, his eye lit with a brightness that seemed caught from some faraway sea beacon, filled his glass with the red and glowing vintage of the south, and leaning towards the water rat, compelled his gaze and held him, body and soul, while he talked. Those eyes were of a changing, foam-streaked grey-green of leaping northern seas. In the glass shone a hot ruby that seemed the very heart of the south, beating for him who had courage to respond to its pulsation. The twin lights, the shifting grey and the steadfast red, mastered the water rat and held him bound, fascinated and powerless. The quiet world outside their rays receded far away and ceased to be, and the talk, the wonderful talk, flowed on. Or was it speech entirely, or did it pass at times into song? Chanty of the sailors weighing the dripping anchor, sonorous hum of the shrouds in a tearing northeaster, ballad of the fisherman hauling his nets at sundown against an apricot sky, chords of guitar and mandolin from gondola or cake.